Hello and welcome back to another review video. Today I'm doing my 25.5 high elo top lane tier list. So if you enjoy content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. I've kind of redone this one. There were a couple of changes over the last two patch. I didn't do one in the previous patches. There wasn't a huge amount which really went into it. But this patch we saw some direct changes which affect some of the top champions within the tier. So let's get into it. The D tier is going to consist of relatively similar such champions. I just don't really think have a great place in high elo at the moment. The likes of Tahm Kench has really suffered over the last couple of patches with both direct nerfs and nerfs towards his itemization. There are some bugs which you can use on him, but then you do put yourself at risk of being banned, so use at your own risk. But I do think this champion is just in a really rough spot at the moment. There is rarely a place where he is optimal. He is a cheese pick at best in most scenarios. Maokai has really fallen from grace in the top lane. It was nice to see him back as a actual top laner for a while. He was used as like a counter pick into the Jax matchup, and we saw him in other spots as well. He's a valuable flex pick and has really good tank builds, but over time they've nerfed his tank builds quite aggressively. Fimbulwinter and Unending Despair are considerably worse items compared to where they were in 5-6 patches ago, and he has really suffered from that. There is rarely a time where I'd recommend flexing Maokai into the top lane, unless it's maybe a free matchup where you can kind of get his CC and scaling for free. But most times you're just going to put him with support or jungle. Those roles tend to perform better when you are playing him in higher elo. The other D tier champion is Alawi. I think this pick has just kind of fallen out of like any sort of meta. This pick traditionally, even when strong, only really does well in low and mid MMR brackets. In high elo, she's always struggled as an option, relying quite heavily on just hitting one spell to be useful as a champion. Most players will play around it or pick champions which will just exploit her biggest weaknesses, and right now she's really not a great spot. I think that the champion could really do with just an overall kit rework. She is in a frustrating spot. She doesn't sometimes interact the way you expect her to interact, and a lot of her kind of like play arounds are just not that fun and interactive. So yeah, I could definitely see her being reworked in the distant future at some point. Moving on to the C tier, some of these options are accessible in certain spots, maybe not optimal, but can definitely be played if you are feeling very comfortable on them and you like see the right opportunity to play them. Likes of Udyr, for example, has definitely been nerfed quite aggressively. He's definitely struggled with some of the itemization nerfs as well. In the jungle, it's not as prevalent. He can oftentimes scale or get the item spikes which he really wants to be able to clear quickly and then skirmish as he needs. In the top lane though, he has definitely fallen a lot weaker ever since they nerfed his double R. It really hurt his early levels wave clear, and it hurt his ability to trade, which was one of the big things which Udyr had going for him. He was previously he was very unassailable early on, as he would just stat check you with his ultimate of his R ability. Other picks here are the likes of Yorick, who does well in low elo and can still be supported to an extent in Master, but the higher up you go, people will play around Maiden a lot more effectively and just kind of nullify what this champion wants to effectively be as the side laning, like punishing poor macro kind of champion. There are one tricks who make it work, and most champions on this list, if you do one trick them, you can climb to high elo, but Yorick is definitely going to have a harder time. What you traditionally see when like one tricks play him is they'll go like very niche builds, whether that's like hybrid, bruiser, Leandry variants or full lethality variants in the past, which then ended up obviously being nerfed as they were overperforming. This pick just never really tends to be that functional as a champion the higher up you go. Zed is a C-tier option at the moment. He has seen a surge in pick rate ever since he got buffed in this patch. He is still not a pick I'd really recommend in the top lane. He's like, if you feel comfortable playing Zed mid, maybe you'll take him into the top lane if you've been auto-filled. Outside of that though, you're not really going to be playing him. I think this champion performs pretty poorly in the top lane, as he kind of ruins team compositions for the most part, lacking like the CC, the skirmishing, or the like durability a lot of the other top laners hold. Nasus is not the greatest at the moment. Even in low MMR, he's in one of the weaker spots he's been in. They kind of tagged him a couple of times with like the E nerf, the Q nerf, and the lifesteal nerf. They obviously then compensated it and gave that back, but he still underperforms here. If Nasus ever really wants to be viable in high elo again, he needs to have some power put back in his E so he can effectively clear the wave, because right now he struggles, and if you ever dive the Nasus, he falls behind. It can be really hard to find yourself ever back in the game, and Nasus doesn't scale. I mean, he obviously scales like in your level 9 to like 13, 18 mark, but doesn't like have infinite, well, I mean, he has infinite scaling, but doesn't really ever accessibly get to like those center points where you can have enough range to kind of like kill people from across the map. Nasus will always struggle in that aspect. He doesn't have range, and that is the biggest weakness of the champion. Sidus sits within the C tier. He's a counter pick you can bring out every so often. I don't think he's per se a bad champion, but you do want to pick him in good situations. He is a multi-flex pick, obviously, as well, so he does have some value in that aspect, but he only ever really come in as like an R5, maybe B4, B5, if top lane has shown. Galio, reduced merely like a rumble counter pick at this point. Outside of that, you're not really playing Galio. There are some AP matchups which he can be fine in, but he will struggle into most skirmishes and AD bruisers. The champion will just get he would just be stat checked and killed. The pick relies quite heavily on utilizing his magic shield on rotation and high base damage to kind of nullify what a lot of the mages want to do. Mundo and Mordekaiser wrap up the C tier. Mundo got buffed this patch, and it was elite scoop buff. They buffed his base HP. It makes him harder to dive and harder to kill early on to the game. He needs more than that, though. He's still not a great champion here. He's about average to okay in low MMR with the Heartsteel nerf, so he's definitely suffered, and that was why they buffed him. In Mordekaiser's case, most people just understand how to play around the champion once you go Master Plus. Like, this pick is a relatively slow-moving juggernaut, which relies very heavily on stat checking, just autoing someone down. If you play around Mordekaiser correctly, then he will struggle to get into fights and ult people, and will oftentimes find himself just being burnt down by like long-range harass before, he can effectively be a pick. The B tier consists of some decent champions. The likes of Kiana, I think, is a really good pick at the moment for mid lane. In the top lane, though, we once again kind of like Zed see it as like a flex option. I don't think it's like a great top laner. I think it is if you've been auto-filled kind of pick, but I don't think the pick is bad by any means, and I think against certain matchups you can definitely have a good time. Teemo also has some really good matchups within the top lane. Jungle Teemo is fine. Like, I think Jungle Teemo is probably his better role when you go into high elo, but Teemo just generalistically isn't a great high elo champion. He wants to scale, and he has pretty clear weaknesses. But if you are comfortable on Teemo, you can definitely make this champion work at the moment. Anivia it's like Cassiopeia, but worse in the top lane, oftentimes punishing champions which just don't have the mobility to get onto her. Words hard. This champion obviously has seen some level of competitive play. I believe we've seen Broken Blade, Vashai, Zeus, like a couple different people play it. I think it has its spot, and if you are comfortable on it, you can definitely make it work. If you haven't put the games in on it, though, you're just not going to really play it. Volibear has definitely seen better days in the top lane. A direct nerf to him towards the end of last split, I believe, where they took like 1 or 2 seconds off his ECD, combined with his itemization just getting a bit weaker. It's definitely left in a weaker spot, especially for high elo. So I think he's a decent mid to low elo pick, and you can definitely be very stat checky. It's very hard for a lot of champions to kind of match you early on, and your wave clear is very oppressive, so you can oftentimes shove in waves and secure at least like one set of grubs with this champion. Varus and Vayne go together. These picks are incredibly volatile ranged top laners. They are really good in specific spots. Like, if your composition can allow it, these two picks are very oppressive isolated marksmen. They have really good damage. I mean, in Vayne's case, Black's wave clear, Varus to an extent doesn't have the greatest wave clear, but if they can just pin you to your tower, they can output a huge amount of damage, and it can be very hard for a lot of tanks and some bruiser skirmishers to really fight back against them. So I do think these two have a place within the top lane at the moment. Swain's case mostly coming out as a counterpick to tanks and like a tank jungle. That is where this champion really like finds its value. Blind Swain in the top lane, not great. You don't really want to bring it out in most situations. Trundle, I kind of underrated this pick. I think he's actually better now that they've done the changes to the towers, now that turret fortification is no longer a thing, and they've kind of just changed things to be anti-lane swap. I think Trundle has really benefited from that as a pick, and so is Tryndamere, which is why you'll see these champions placed slightly higher on the list. Big problem with Trundle is he's just very, very clear in his game pattern, and a lot of people can play around that very accordingly. His E can be an effective tool for like interrupting channels, which is definitely some of the skill expression on the pick. Other than that, he's just a stat checky, decent into tank and AD bruiser champion. Ryze sits within the B tier. I think if you're comfortable on Ryze, you can play him in high elo, and he has some decent matchups, which he can obviously utilize his short range but high DPS spells. In Wukong's case, he's more of a gimmick pick. Like, if you can pilot Wukong well in the top lane, you're probably doing fine at the moment. I don't think he is the creme de la creme, but there is definitely value to this champion. He is a good AD bruiser, and if you get to like your 1, your 2 item spikes, he can be quite powerful. He does have a harder time laning against specific champions, like once again he's relegated to more as a counter pick option, but if you find the right spots, can definitely be a valuable pick. Sin just incredibly niche, obviously played primarily just by one tricks. If you're one trick of a champion, he's fine. Like he has always functioned well as a solo queue option. If you're not, you're probably not going to play him, but if you do, then yeah, you can put the time into him and definitely learn the champion. He's just very unique in how he functions within the game. Set is the like low elo, mid elo kind of bruiser. He's always been fine. I wouldn't say Set has been. I mean, there have been times where Set's actually been bad, but like for the most part, he's traditionally fine. You can definitely make him work. He does have pretty good early game damage. His E can be a very oppressive ability if you can find the right angles. I think this champion's bad by any means. I just think he tends to be weaker than some of the other options. He's pretty clear in his game plan, and if he doesn't really get the advantages early on to the game, he could definitely struggle compared to some of the other bruisers within the top lane. Heimerdinger, another pick like Singed, where if you play it, you're probably doing fine with it at the moment, but isn't like a pick I'd really recommend unless once again you've put hundreds of hours into the champion. Kled, another one of these, like you really need to understand how Kled functions as a champion to forge really strong early game advantages, because if you don't, then the champion will feel relatively lackluster compared to other options. His early game damage is incredibly oppressive though, and he has some of the best tower dives within the game, so you do have to play around that. Nocturne, so this is one which has kind of been, well, I mean, Veigar V2 has shown me this pick as like being an option in both mid and top lane. Broken Blade has also been playing some Nocturne lane, and I don't think it's bad. I think it has clear weaknesses such as his mana issues, the fact that he doesn't have great getaway tools. Like there are champions which can probably just run him over and he can't really do anything about that, but he is incredibly stat checky. If you can find the angles to like block a pretty telegraphed skill, and then you can just stat check into someone with your Q and your passive autos, this champion can be quite oppressive. He has a very powerful ultimate as well, and can oftentimes just push in a wave top and then roam onto mid, even bot lane if you like find the timers to do so. So I'd say he's a relatively solid B tier pick. I'd recommend watching Veigar, and I'd recommend watching Broken Blade if you're looking for people who play a decent amount of, well, I mean in Broken Blade's case some Nocturne top, and then Veigar's case some Nocturne mid traditionally. Shen, I'm not a huge fan of at the moment. I think this pick has really clear weaknesses, and tank items just have generally left a lot of tanks feeling quite bad about their itemization, which is why you see a lot of dead man's tanks at the moment. The likes of Shen, Ornn, Cho'Gath, to name a few, are all champions abusing Deadmans, because it is probably just outright the strongest tank item in the game at the moment, which it probably shouldn't be. I think other tank items are just outright weak now, and whether they end up buffing the tanks or the items, it'll be interesting to see, but right now, yeah, these are some of the abusers. The other tanks around here are the likes of Zac and Sion. I think you can make these tanks work, but compared to some of the other options, they're just not as great at the moment. Tanks just in general are low agency picks and tend to rely more on people carrying within your team to kind of have value. As climb options, I wouldn't really recommend them unless you are very comfortable with that role of just playing a more supportive option within your team. Akali and Renekton wrap up the B tier. Akali, I think, is a really solid option into specific matchups where you can really, unlike team compositions, where you can really utilize the high AP damage of a top laner, combined with maybe a Gwen matchup or was the other one? There was another one which I can't remember off the top of my head. But the Akali does have some good matchups in the top lane, which I definitely recommend looking for and like getting a feel for if you do want to play this champion. If you don't want to play this champion, she's not mandatory at the moment. I just think she's a pretty solid option there for you if needs be. I think Renekton is pretty weak at the moment. It really shows when Renekton isn't hugely played in high elo, combined with not really seeing any competitive play at the moment, that this pick is just a bit lackluster. I think Renekton really struggles with the fact that he's kind of bound to Eclipse, and most Eclipse users don't really want to go Eclipse. They really want the utility of something like a Cleaver, because Cleaver is a very nice item to have on a lot of these champions. It leaves them in a pretty rough spot, and unlike Aatrox, which I would say is kind of broken out of that and has gone things like Cycler Sword, even like Iceborne, Deadman's, Shojin variants. We've got like loads of different things you can do on Aatrox. I think Renekton's kind of definitely struggling a lot more within that spot. Moving on to the A tier then, I'm going to lead off with Azir, which might surprise a lot of people. Well, I think Azir is a really slept on top laner. He's just very underplayed. There are lots of matchups where they can't really interact with Azir, and Azir has really good scaling, so if you can get access to that, I think he can be a really strong option. Cassiopeia has a great time nullifying specific matchups. Honestly, she could probably be a higher A tier option and even close to S tier pick. I think she has very, very oppressive situations. You just obviously run the risk of running a lot of AP in your top side when you are opting into picks like these. Pantheon, don't like him that much, but there's no... he's got value as being a flex pick at the moment. If he didn't have value as a flex pick, I'll probably have him back down to the B tier, but he works fine in a lot of the matchups in the top lane. Like, you have to play him as a counter pick. I think if you run him raw as a top laner, there are a lot of champions where he will just struggle to find kills on early and then end up being outvalued like mid to late game. Like, once you get to level 6, this champion oftentimes will just lose to a lot of picks as he doesn't get access to a combat ultimate. But his roams can be really oppressive. He does good damage with his base kit, and his E can be a very solid ability for just tanking damage. So I think there's definitely value to this champion, but if you want to play him anywhere, play him in the jungle at the moment. That is his best role. Tryndamere sits within the A tier, benefited from the turret fortification changes this patch. He has, I believe, the best tower taking within the... Well, I mean, maybe not the best, but he tends to take towers the quickest out of any champion. I've used the wrong term again. He, when you look at data, takes the most towers or plates, or I can't remember, or takes towers the fastest. There is something which relates to that, but yeah. Tryndamere, really good at tower taking. Let's just leave it at that. Benefited from that this patch, so yeah, sits within the A tier at the moment. He's got a obviously very like standard playstyle of just sieging, sustaining of wave with like your Ravenous, your rune set, and then yeah, just continuing. And a lot of champions just can't match that, and that can give him a lot of value as a top lane option. You can also work in the mid lane. Gangplank sits in the A tier. They buffed him recently, and he's doing better for it. Like, giving him, I believe it was some armor growth, does help in some of those AD matchups. I think he's an incredibly high skilled champion. Like, if you want to play Gangplank, watch Solo Backer. You do need to be comfortable playing this pick though. Like, if you play a bad Gangplank, you will get punished for it. You will lose games. So it's a pick I'd recommend avoiding in those aspects. But I presume, like, if you're watching a high elo top lane tier list and you're like Master Plus, then you've put the time into Gangplank, you feel comfortable with the pick. And I'd say he's doing a bit better at the moment. Aatrox, he's decent. I think he has options for different matchups, which can make him a bit more flexible than what people are like led on to believe. I still primarily believe you want to play this champion into like tankier matchups and tankier team compositions where you can make full use of your sustain and people can't really move you, and that is where the real value of Aatrox comes in. But I think you can work in more spots than just that. Karma, I have it as an A2 option. She's like my AP utility pick at the moment. I would recommend people trying to like play her, but she's weaker. The nerf towards Axiom Arcanist did hurt of this patch, and I just leave her a bit low on the A tier. She's not going to do as much damage as like your raw AP options, but if you're looking for someone with enchanter aspects and who can just usually clear waves and then just move onto like mid or play around like objectives, then I think Karma can do that job pretty nicely. Garen could probably sit towards the higher end of the A tier. This pick obviously benefited a lot from Axiom Arcanist being added to the game, combined with just other changes and the fact that he is a very linear playstyle of just being able to clear waves and then move, which seems to be like a real theme at the moment with a lot of champions, where if they can just clear waves and then use that tempo to kind of move around the map, do other things, then they tend to operate really nicely within solo queue. I think Garen, obviously also moving towards Swifties as well, has really benefited him. People were going Zerkers for a long time, and Swifties do outperform them at the moment, so definitely something to be aware of. But I think Garen as a pick definitely sits as more like a high A tier option at the moment. Quinn, doing better. She got buffed, and then they buffed her boots as well, and her playstyle is all about just cheating tempo, being very quick around the map, picking up an early symbiotic souls, and then just clearing waves with Profane Hydra. I don't think it's like fixes all of her issues. She still has issues like early on into the game, and she can be punished, and she needs to obviously snowball to really find an advantage within the game, but she can be a really oppressive side laner, especially with those advantages, and you can always just abuse the fact that if enemy tries to like use their time to move, that you can either siege or you can just follow them, which can be a very powerful thing at the moment. Urgot sits within the A tier. He's an incredibly good mid to low elo pick, probably the best at the moment, but has the issue where when you go into high elo, a lot of lane matchups really he struggles into. Like, Urgot does not win a huge amount of lanes. He needs to use his like 1 to 3 like strength to really kind of help him out all the way to level 9, which is where he gets access to toggle and becomes a strong champion again, but like 30 or 9, 13, 15 are like your real breakpoints. If you can get access to them, he's a really strong champion. If you can't, then he does fall compared to some of the other AD bruisers with AD bruiser slash juggernauts within the top lane. Yone and Yasuo have in the A tier. I think Yone, generalistically, is a decent pick. I think he's slightly weaker at the moment compared to where he has been within the past. Could arguably put towards the lower end of the A tier. Yasuo, I think, is incredible into specific matchups, which can make him like a really powerful like pick to have within your arsenal at the moment. Things like the Aurora, the Gnar, even the Jace, I believe, can all be matchups where you can play Yasuo and find decent amounts of success. So definitely a pick I'd recommend learning if you do enjoy Yasuo at the moment. I think Gwen is elite skewed in her current state, which might, I think probably being changed at some point. Not to, like, make her unplayable in elite, but make it so some of the like average player base has more access to her, because I think she is one of those champions which a lot of people play the game for and then realize she's actually quite hard to play. And I think in specific matchups, she can be incredibly oppressive, and if you can 3D scale with this pick, she is very strong, similar to the likes of Vladimir. I think Gwen does spike incredibly hard at 3 items, probably the strongest of like any champion within the game, but Vladimir, also similar pattern. I think both these picks, very good if you just get access to your items and you can put them in like really good matchups. Not blindable, but can function if you get the items on them. Kayle and Aurora are more AP options accessible to you at the moment. Rumble is another one. I think there are a lot of really good AP top laners at the moment. In Kayle's case, she is obviously going to be punished by dives. Like, you can dive a Kayle and put her out of the game, but her scaling is really good at the moment. She has just been buffed a lot of times, and the wave changes at the beginning of the season were probably the best thing to happen to Kayle for a while. You can, it's really hard to zone Kayle off of like first XP now, and getting access to like that XP, like, your level 2, your level 3, it makes it considerably harder to dive Kayle. And I think in general, the champion has really benefited from that. She's obviously going to be innately mid and low elo skewed, and it wouldn't even surprise me if she gets nerfed next patch because of her strength there. But right now, I'd say she's in one of the best spots she's been in for high elo specifically. Still, you want to bring her as a counter pick. You don't want to blind Kayle. There are a lot of hard matchups, which will still very much punish you early on to the game. But if you play her into a tank, you can oftentimes just 3D scale and get the value you want out of this champion. Aurora got nerfed this patch, and she's definitely weaker. She sits as more like a mid A tier option than like an S tier option. It was a 10% AP ratio after her E, so it wasn't like the end of the world. She is still an incredibly oppressive laner. Like, there are champions within the game which basically can't dodge her E if they are over like a certain unit size. It is, large enough AoE wise to, always guarantee hits. And if you guarantee an E, then you guarantee a Q traditionally if the champion just doesn't have the mobility to dodge it. So this pick, in certain matchups can still be very oppressive. I think she is weaker generally though now, and the R nerf does also affect her, so she sits as more like an A tier option. Doesn't scale quite as effectively. Rumble is always going to be a pro skewed pick for the most part. He is fine in he's good in elite at the moment. Like, he has an incredibly oppressive laning phase, and the way he functions with the wave where he doesn't need to auto the wave and he can just spellcast in front of the wave, which can zone and just chunk people out, gives him a lot of effective power in like high elo and elite scenarios where people will more like abuse the power of this champion. Still don't think he's quite as good as he was before. He has been directly nerfed a couple of times, but sits as more like a solid A tier champion. Gragas is another solid A tier pick. He's not as strong at the moment, and that is also why he's not quite an S tier option as he traditionally would be. But I think this pick, still, if you give him the items, get the haste on the champion, can be incredibly incredibly powerful displacement champion. Like, if you can push people around into the spots where you want them to be, you can peel your carries, you have good amounts of tools for that. I think this champion can be really good, combined with his decent laning phase. Like, once you get access to some mana items, I think he has a relatively decent time as an A tier option. Rengar and Warwick I'm going to have here as well. In Warwick's case, I actually think he could probably be towards the high end of the A tier. I think some of the high A tier options are like your Cassiopeias, your Warwicks. I think these picks can be really good in the right spots. In Rengar's case, he's primarily just played by one tricks, but I think the one tricks are still feeling really successful on the champion at the moment. He does a huge amount of damage, and people just don't understand how to play against Rengar top. He hasn't been hugely popular in a while, and that gives strength to the champion. In Warwick's case, he is actually more elite skewed in top lane than jungle, where jungle is more low elo skewed, which is interesting to see, obviously, as it's the same champion. But Warwick top lane is incredibly early game skewed, and being able to run over a champion early. Some certain champions just really can't interact with Warwick because he will just stat check them, sustain off the wave. It can be a really hard matchup for a lot of picks, and yeah, that gives him a lot of power in high elo. So I think Warwick sits as a very solid high A tier option. He does fall off quite aggressively and does have some really hard matchups. Like for example, Argot really has quite a comfortable time into Warwick. Warwick can never really play into Argot, so that is always something to be careful of. The other champion here is Cassante. He got nerfed this patch, and it's definitely left him in a weaker spot. He, lost 8 damage off his passive, combined with 20%, I believe, of the W, which hurts his, like, really high ends. Like, the early game oppressiveness of this pick is weaker, and it is noticeable. The random one-shots with DW is also down. Like, you're not going to as consistently just find an angle onto the ADC, get that true damage, spike them, and hit them with a passive and just kill them. They are going to have to take a bit more damage, and that is meaningful. Cassante is definitely a weaker pick. He could honestly be dropped all the way down to, like, a mid-A tier pick. I think there are good champions into him as well, and I think a lot of those are really thriving this patch, so definitely something to be cognitive of. I think he sits as more like a mid to high end A tier option. I managed to miss Malphite. Malphite should be sat within the B tier alongside the other tanks. I think he is a good R5 pick, but the problem with picking a tank as an R5 pick, it's just lower agency, and that is noticeable when you are playing Malphite. Like, you can be really valuable within games, and I think that can definitely be into especially AD compositions. But things like Sunfires just aren't great items at the moment. Like, you want to go like Malignance, for example, so you have the damage to really be quite oppressive within lane, and then opting into armor is how I'd recommend trying him. But obviously Sunfires is more of the default option if you're just looking for raw durability. Moving on to the S tier then, we lead off with Ambessa. She got nerfed this patch. She's still a very good high-elo pick. She's incredibly skill expressive. Most people are beginning to reach, like, one-tricks are beginning to reach, like, the cap of her skill. It has taken a while, though. Like, I think this champ does have a lot of depth, so put a lot of time into her, and you should be able to find the results. If you haven't, she is definitely weak at this patch. There are polarizing matchups. There are matchups where Ambessa will really struggle. The Camille's, the Pantheons, even the Renekton's, but Renekton is a bit weak at the moment, so it's kind of whatever. But yeah, Ambessa definitely not doing as well with the nerfs, but still a very solid option. Poppy, I've also missed. She was supposed to be in the A tier. She got changed this patch. It helped top lane Poppy. Nerfed Poppy support very slightly. I believe actually she stayed almost neutral, and Poppy jungle actually lost the most power, which is kind of unfortunate. But Poppy top, scales better now, but not as strong early on to the game, which is noticeable. Like, Poppy top needs to be able to get through laning phase. She has a pretty hard time if you take away a lot of her damage. I think the passive being slightly smaller and her E doing 20 less damage is meaningful, and I think a lot of people will feel that. With the 20% bonus AD ratio being added onto the Evo, you might start opting into D-Blade in matchups where you really feel like you can push your advantage, so definitely something to be aware of. Moving on from Ambessa, we have Jax. He got buffed recently. They increased his mana per level, I believe, and they also gave him some more health growth and gave him a bit more damage on the ultimate attack damage, not the actual spell cast, and he did benefit from that. I think he goes from an A tier to like an S tier option. I still think there are some quite hard matchups for Jax, but it wouldn't surprise me if he really takes over Last Stand. The direct nerfs to Ambessa and Cassante help him, combined with lane swaps being most likely gone as we know them. I think Jax really benefits from that, so definitely a champion to watch. I think he sits as a very solid S tier option. Kennen, incredibly underrated AP pick at the moment. I think this champion really can be oppressive in a lot of lanes, and a lot of people will just don't really respect the champion at the moment. I think he has an incredibly powerful ultimate. He has great lane harass, decent scaling. I think this pick is, in a really solid spot at the moment. Nah, I missed as well. It sits within the A tier. I had Nah in the S tier in the previous one. I think he has some really hard lanes which are quite popular at the moment. The likes of Aurelia, he really struggles with, and that traditionally is going to be what you ban. But there are other matchups where if they have the ability to counter him, he really struggles as a pick. He's a very squishy champion early onto the game and has to rely on that one jump to kind of drag the distance out between him and the opponent. And certain champions like Yasuo can close that distance, so definitely something to be aware of. Olaf, great into really specific actually great into a lot of matchups at the moment. Olaf with his ultimate is an incredibly powerful champion. It can actually be really damaging for certain team compositions to play against him. Like Lethality Varus, for example, can really struggle with Olaf, as when you ult him, he will just run at you and you don't have the DPS to take him down. And team compositions with low DPS really do struggle into him. You're playing into a double tank topside, Olaf will have a great time. Biggest pick, definitely in a lot better of a spot at the moment. Really solid S tier option. The other picks my S tier are the likes of Aurelia, Jace, we've got two more, Camille and Fiora. In the case of, actually I'll separate Jace from the other three. In the case of Aurelia, she still is an incredibly powerful early game pick. Once you get that bulk spike, she is incredibly potent and has a huge amount of damage, being able to utilize the wave effectively to sustain up and just take most champions down with it. This pick really doesn't have a huge amount of like matchups which can outright like fight back against her if you are playing around the wave correctly, and that is a lot of what it really comes down to, just knowing thresholds, playing the wave well, and forging advantages and then using those advantages to get like your balks, your hull breakers, and then just taking over the game. The addition of the split push change to Aurelia really helped her quite a bit. It had additional damage to towers, is meaningful, and maintaining passive on towers very solid for her. So definitely really doing quite a bit better at the moment. Has been direct nerfed a couple of times, but not in the spots where she really does need to be nerfed. In Camille's case, she's doing a bit better at the moment. I believe the change to the true damage, I don't know if it affected Camille for the most. I believe Camille already had some level of amplification with the true damage change, but it really helped Fiora if you are like opting into PTA. I think PTA actually was boosted on both these champions with the true damage change. I can't remember specifically though if like that was already a thing on Camille, but I know one of them did benefit from it. I just can't remember. Yeah, but Camille has some really good matchups. She, if given access to like side lanes and like the resources she needs, really hard to match her. She's great 1v2, great 2v1 rather. Like her ultimate is incredibly powerful ability, and that's something you've always got to watch out for. Like her 2v1s, if you ever get caught out it by once, she gets the gold, she sieges your tower, and you'll find yourself in a really hard position to play from. Fiora has really good matchups, and that, like, if you put yourself in a position where you can kind of just freely proc vitals, you can utilize your W offensively. I think this pick is in a really solid spot at the moment. Not quite S+, as I do think she has some hard matchups. I do think if you fall behind, it can be quite hard to play this champion. But in her current state, I definitely she's doing really well at the moment. In Jace's case, they adjusted him to push him away from tank builds, but AD builds are doing really well on him at the moment. If you can get access to like your Eclipse, your Manamune, he's an incredibly solid pick in the top lane. Plus the fact that he's still a flex pick to the mid lane, it's a lot harder to answer him when there are people which will just take it and play it mid. I think this pick is definitely doing a lot better at the moment. There are hard matchups, but a lot of them aren't great champions at the moment. The likes of your Scions, your Malphites, I think are harder matchups for Jace, but not great picks, and a lot of people won't really want to play them unless they are given like the perfect game scenarios. My S+ options are Darius and Riven. Doing Darius is actually an S+ option, but the rise of Darius jungle, like doubling Darius top lane's pick rate at the moment, has kind of led to a it's like really hard to answer Darius. Darius can be picked early in draft, and you will usually presume it goes jungle now. If it goes top lane, well, I mean, that is something that can happen, and most people can't really pick as an answer to Darius, because, well, if you pick it as an answer to Darius, and then enemy picks something which is really good into your answer to Darius, well, you can find yourself in a really hard position where they have Darius jungle, a really strong pick at the moment, and an answer to your top lane option. I think that gives Darius a lot of strength in his current state, and combined with that, he's just a really good top laner. There are lots of matchups which he can freely play against. A lot of the tanks are just weaker at the moment, and if you get leads over a lot of the bruisers and squish your champions within the game, and like you get access to your Strikebreaker early against some of your ranged options, I think this pick is in an incredibly good spot, and definitely deserving of at least an S spot, maybe if like Jungle Darius wasn't quite as overtuned as it is. And then Riven is my premier pick of the patch. She's been really good for a while. This champion obviously takes a lot of skill to pilot well, but if you pilot Riven well, get the leads you want, and like do execute the amount of damage you need to kill a target, she's incredibly powerful, and she will take over games. She has she has some of the most agency a top laner can have, with the amount of mobility and then like map room potential combined with not having mana cost. Just gives her a lot of power at the moment, and I think she is the premier pick if you play her. If you don't play her, then obviously that's definitely going to be something you could struggle with, but you can ban her, obviously, and then play something else, you know. I think tanks are really out of the meta at the moment, which is, well, I mean, to an extent, for some people, unfortunate. To others, happy, because obviously it's a very skirmish, fight-heavy meta at the moment, where if you can get early game advantages, you can really forge out leads, getting access to just roaming, tempo advantages, sieging towers, and then using that to, once again, snowball more of an advantage. Those are my thoughts, so thank you guys for watching. I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.